Alrighty, welcome everybody. I am very excited. We're going to have a roundtable tonight. It's almost the 4th anniversary of the big breaking Kamloops story, the mass grave. And over the course of that time, we saw calls to cancel Canada Day. We saw a huge outcry across the country. We saw statues of our founding fathers fall to the ground. And it was said we were told it was understandable. Since then, even internationally, a lot of people believed, well, I guess Canada is inherently racist. It's history. And not only that, but there was a motion passed in Parliament that was unanimously agreed upon by all members of Parliament that residential schools are or were genocide. And on the panel with me tonight, we have people who disagree with this claim and some of them have been studying Indigenous issues for over a decade. I'll give a quick introduction to them. And from there, we're going to pass it off to Francis Widdowson because it sounds like they have a plan to fight back against all of this misinformation that is tainting Canadian history, Canadian identity, and trying to really... we'll get into the kind of the ramifications of why it's so important to correct the record here, and more importantly, just be able to, question history and interrogate these sort of beliefs that have been aggressively thrust upon the entire nation, and that we're just supposed to agree as fact. So we'll get some people on here in just a moment, but of course we have Francis Widdowson, who is a professor who was fired. Speaking out on some of these issues. We have a filmmaker, Simon Hergott, and the two of them have already released a short documentary, What Remains? What Remains? What Remains? Or What Remains with a question mark. But that's a great documentary we'll be covering as well. And we also have Michelle Stirling on the roundtable tonight. And of course, Jim McMurtry, who's a school teacher who was fired basically instantly for speaking out against this news item about 4 years ago. Now, let me get Francis Widdowson up here. Just 1 second, and we'll pass it off to Francis. Let's see. Can you hit the request to speak button, Francis? You there, Francis?
Am I here? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Greg. I'm incredibly excited to be here. This matter is very urgent at this stage because we are coming up to the 4-year anniversary of the announcement that happened on May 27th, 2021, which I'll talk about shortly, which was the Kamloops Indian Band's claim that the remains of 215 children have been confirmed at the site next to the former residential school. But before I just give a brief introduction into that issue, I just wanted to, first of all, thank Greg so much for hosting this space, because we really want to talk about this issue, which many people have suffered serious consequences from trying to speak the truth about what has happened and the resulting terrible divisiveness and falsehoods that we have been fed by a number of institutions. Anyway, I have a long background in this area. I was a professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary. My area of specialization was Aboriginal policy. And as a professor for 13 years, from 2008 to 2021, I was tenured, which meant that I could only be fired if I engaged in malpractice or was incompetent or corrupt. These were very serious charges. Anyway, I have been going through many processes for the last 5 years. And I went through arbitration, a whole year of arbitration in 2023. The arbitrator, although the decision was terrible and had many problems, I was found to have been wrongfully terminated, but it was decided that I could not be reinstated because Aboriginal scholars at Mount Royal University felt unsafe at me being there because I asked questions about Indigenous science and I asserted that the residential schools were not genocidal. And these issues were seen as a deal breaker for me being at Mount Royal University. And in terms of my views on genocide, which is a what's called a prescribed doctrine in universities now, you must assert that the residential schools were genocidal, and if you don't, you will suffer serious consequences. And many people just don't say anything about it because they're afraid when they see what's happened to me and other people. This idea, my opposition to this idea of the residential schools being genocidal comes about from 30 years of research. And Albert Howard and I wrote a book in 2008, which has never gone out of style and is becoming more and more relevant because people are now talking about the reconciliation industry in British Columbia. And this is part of a wider entity called the Aboriginal industry, which is a group of lawyers and consultants who earn their living from maintaining Aboriginal people in a state of dependency. And the residential schools is a major Aboriginal industry initiative. And lawyers have made hundreds of millions of dollars off of the residential schools. And I started studying the residential schools in particular in 2016 and discovered all the legal kinds of machinations which were happening where students were encouraged, former students were encouraged to make various claims to get settlements. And we've been seeing that over the last, 20, 30 years. And then things all fell apart in 2021 with the announcement that I was just talking about. And $320 million just off the start was awarded on the basis of this claim. The Kamloops band received $12.1 million to do excavations, yet not one shovel has gone into the ground. And then we have a whole host of legal initiatives that were started because of the Kamloops case, and as well, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was pushed through the House of Commons immediately after the announcement. So that brings us to the matter at hand, which is the Kamloops case, the grave error at Kamloops. And there's a book that has been produced about this that is edited by Chris Champion and Tom Flanagan called Grave Error: How the Media Misled Us and the Truth About Residential Schools. I have a contribution in there, and it's called Billy Remembers. And what it talks about is, as I mentioned, on May 27th, it was announced by the Kamloops band that the remains of 215 children had been confirmed. It wasn't a speculation. It wasn't potential. There was no wording like that. They said that they had confirmed this. And because of this, because people thinking that there had been a whole bunch of children slaughtered and put into a mass grave, because that's what you think when you hear about 215, you're not going to have individual burial sites dug for that purpose. We had the flags lowered at half-mast. We had memorials all across the country. We had all sorts of politicians making very emotional statements. And then we had the burning of dozens of churches. And it turned out that this was false, that no such remains had been confirmed, and no remains continue to be, there's no confirmation of any remains. And it is highly improbable. It's not probable, it's possible, but it's highly improbable that there will be any remains found there, because we don't have any parent who has said that their children never came home from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And if this is the case, who are the 215 children that are buried in the apple orchard? Anyway, I'm on a research group which includes Michelle Stirling and Jim McMurtry. We have been investigating this for the last 4 years. And now, because of the traction that we are starting to gain with our research, there is something which is called residential school denialism, which is criminalizing asking questions about these falsehoods that are being perpetrated. And British Columbia is where it's all falling apart. Dallas Brody, who's an MLA there, she was pushed out of the Conservative Party because she was defending James Heller, who just wanted to have some information put forward by the Law Society. Instead of, they were saying that unmarked graves have been found at Kamloops. He just wanted to have the word potential put in those materials. He was called a residential school denialist, and also it was implied that he was a racist. He's now suing the Law Society, and Brody was defending him and said 0 bodies had been found. And then she was attacked, called a residential school denialist, and so on, and eventually pushed out of the Conservative Party. So we have a whole bunch of things unfolding now, and that's what our documentary. So Simon Hergott and I have teamed up to produce a documentary on the Kamloops case, and we want to investigate why the truth is under assault. So you cannot speak the truth anymore in Canada about this issue, and why there has been this massive institutional failure from the media, from politicians, from universities, from the RCMP, from the coroner, and it just goes on and on. And why has there been this promotion of these falsehoods? We want to investigate this. And that's what we like to talk about tonight, is the Kamloops case and the wider issue of the residential schools and the falsehoods that are being perpetrated. And who I've got on this roundtable are Simon Hergott, who is an incredible videographer from Kamloops, who has done very important documentaries, but he was the videographer on What Remains. You can watch that on YouTube. I think it is incredibly insightful and very informative. And thanks to Simon, it has incredible shots that we were able to get in the town of Pell River. It's about how Pell River was impacted by the Kamloops announcement. And we have Jim McMurtry, who is a teacher who I've known for quite a while. And I'm very impressed by Jim's tenacity. He was fired in 2021. And he just is going to dig in. He's digging in, and he's going to fight them with everything that he has. And that's the kind of people we need. And he was fired for trying to tell the truth about the Kamloops case. And then finally, we have Michelle Stirling, who is a researcher and is the producer of a documentary called The Bitter Roots of Sugarcane, which is a critique of and an expose of a documentary that was produced by National Geographic, amongst who's supposed to be a prestigious entity. And that was supposed to be a documentary, and it was all sorts of highly questionable types of arguments and insinuations of things which did not happen. And Michelle's probably going to want to talk about that, her critique of that supposed documentary, which was nominated for an Academy Award. That's how people thought that it was so important. Anyway, what I'd like to do is I'd like, first of all, to call upon Simon maybe to say a few words about What Remains, the documentary, as well as the documentary that we're planning, and also his experience in the media, because he was a journalist for over a decade with mainstream media outlets and has some experience with the media. And then we'll turn it over to Jim McMurtry and then Michelle Stirling.
Simon, I think we sent you an invitation to speak. Let me just double check on that. But Yeah, if it's there, then click.
And if Simon's not available at this point, he needs to get some technology. We can just pass it on to Jim McMurtry.
I'm here if needed.
Jim, why don't you speak since you're available?
Well, what are the parameters here? Because obviously I'd be happy to, many people know my story. I'd be happy to take questions, starting with anything that Greg might have to ask. I'd love to know how much time you would like me to speak for.
I think if you just speak for a couple of minutes about your case and how it relates to the Kamloops, the grave area at Kamloops. Just because there might be some people on this X space that don't know what happened to you.
Oh, okay.
But
well,
don't go. Like, you don't need all the details.
But I won't go for too long because many people, of course, starting with you and Michelle, know this all so well. So I'd love to take a couple of minutes. So I'm a teacher and who was asked one day by my principal to speak about the news out of Kamloops. This precise day will always be with me because it was my father's birthday. May 31st, 2021, there's an article in the Western Standard just today by the remarkable former Judge Brian Giesbrecht, who talked about the social hysteria at the time. I certainly never, as a teacher, anytime in the last 10 or so years, went near the subject of residential schools because it's verboten, to use a German word. It's something that's too dangerous for teachers. But I didn't have a choice because the whole school was prepped to undertake like a 2-minute hate against people like me, white teachers, because of their actions in Kamloops and murdering and secretly burying 215 Indigenous children. But I was given no choice because that's what the school did. It became the theater that was served. Most of the kids were in orange in one way or another, including face paint, which I thought was very politically incorrect. And so it was very intentionally. They'd worked all day at the school on Friday. I was a substitute teacher, so I didn't know that. It wasn't at the school. Preparing for this. So the first thing out of my mouth when I got to the school was I asked the kids, why were they wearing orange? Why all decorated in orange? Because there is an orange shirt day, as you know, in Canada, but that's September 30th. So it didn't make any sense to me that they were doing it. But right away, I guess I presented myself as, to use the word that Francis already brought up, a denialist. So anyhow, I said the wrong thing with regard to the social hysteria. I was supposed to present the Saint Anne nuns and the Oblate priests and also the Indigenous staff, because there were 3 teachers who were Indigenous at the school, which is in the heart of the reserve in Kamloops, right across from the downtown part of the city of Kamloops, and was visited all the time by Indian agents, government inspectors of different stripes, by doctors, nurses, by parents as well. So there was even in the latter years of the school, the Kamloops Indian Residential School, there was an Indigenous principal. So it's not just people like my 4 recent ancestors who worked as missionaries in Canada. It was the indictment is also of Indigenous people who worked at the school, and not just, again, on teaching staff, but doing residential duty and cleaning and cooking and so forth. So to me, the whole thing is outrageous. I was walked out within half an hour of saying that these kids didn't die nefariously, that they died mostly from disease. In fact, there was a sanitarium for tuberculosis victims, only 20 minutes drive away from the school. So I think most people, I'm sure, if not everybody, right, that is listening to me right now, is very aware of the fact that disease killed all sorts of people not so long ago. And I was just reading a book on Sir Johnny MacDonald, and Sir Johnny MacDonald had 3 children, and one of them ended up being terribly disabled. Another one died without getting out childhood, and the third one ended up becoming a member of Parliament. But that was 1 out of 3 had the regular sort of life that we would want everybody to have. Life was very different 100, 150 years ago. So just turning, so that's the beginning of my story. I won't say anything more except outside of the what Francis has already indicated, and that my tenacity. And I will frame it a little bit differently, that it's my outrage, that I worked very hard for a long time, for over 40 years, to be the best teacher that I could be. I had hoped to be a university professor because I did a PhD at the University of Toronto. I studied deeply ever since on anything to do with Canadian educational history and philosophy. And so I knew I didn't do anything wrong. But even if I had done something wrong, said something wrong, the idea of marching me out and having me sit at home now for 4 years, it's been almost 4 years to the day that I haven't been able to teach children, and I know I never will be again. So to me, without people like Francis and me, and others, of course, including, but particularly Francis and me, because we were both fired because of this, the tremendous sensitivity toward anything Indigenous, to the extent where people believe anything out of their mouths, including the fact that Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip kidnapped 10 children from the school in the early 1960s who were never seen again. So, and this gets into the media and so forth. So there's just no discrimination, discernment by anyone in the media and government. They'll run with anything an Indigenous person says. So this has not just cost me my job, it's cost me my dignity. And it's over my dead body that I'm going to give up. I've been offered money. I've been offered, of course, many threats. I'm experiencing the tactic of just slow walking my proceedings since it's been 4 years. But I'm not going away. I've written a book that's going to come out in a week or so. And I'm just hoping that other people recognize that without people like me and Francis, then this would happen to other people. And it's very wrong. And what students need, Francis's focus is universities. Mine is the K-12 system. What students not only need, but merit is the truth. If they ask me about anything, I think it's incumbent upon me to tell them what science tells them it to be, what the established opinion is. And the fact that I'm supposed to blatantly lie to kids about murdered children in a school not so far away from the school that I was teaching is just unacceptable. So I am not bending. Thank you for listening to my little introduction.
Thank you so much, Jim. Just wanted to hop in really quick. Like you said, you face a lot of consequences for speaking out. And, I feel very passionately about this because I'm also working on a documentary, and it's about how people will get systematically smeared. They'll have their sort of dignity and reputation attacked wrongfully. And it seems to all be coming from a similar place, coming from a sort of, far left authoritarian place. And good on you for fighting for your, not only just your reputation, but fighting for, what is good, Like too often people who get thrown into the deplorable basket of being right wing or far right because you have the wrong opinion. I struggle with this. Sometimes I'm so used to it. I'm so used to being called the bad guy that I almost start to believe it. But in reality, we are the good guys. We are the ones who are trying to tell the truth here. We're trying to correct the record. And it becomes so obvious when, you were talking about the possibility of people getting sick and dying at these residential schools because it was so long ago. And even presenting something reasonable like that, there's no nuance allowed. It's just like genocide or nothing. And that's sort of like authoritarian, black or white thinking of Canadian history, and something as complicated as that is obviously a red flag for anybody who's thinking clearly. But I really appreciate you talking about that attitude of like, over my dead body, am I gonna, let my reputation get smeared and kind of let the truth be misrepresented by these people.
Thank you. If I could just do a quick rejoinder and say to you, I think many people in the audience, but also in our country, have come to the realization that there are no graves in Kamloops, that there were no murdered children, that there are no missing children. There never were any missing children. And as Francis said, no parent ever said, I'm missing a child. And yet what you hear from people who have got to that point, so certainly that's an advance, but they go, But residential schools were like the Holocaust. And still in government and media and so forth, we refer to anyone that went to these schools as a survivor, which to me really cheapens the experience of people who really have experienced a physical or biological genocide. And so I think one of the things that should be accomplished this evening is not only, I think we proved that there's nothing buried in Kamloops other than the truth, but I think we also need to move to the fact that we need to have a balanced account of these schools. These schools were not houses of horror. These schools were educational centers for children, in many cases, who didn't have any parents, orphans, children who didn't have the necessities of life in the home, children who were already dealing with terrible diseases like tuberculosis, and were better off being at the schools where there was, again, regular visits from nurses and doctors, and where there was, beginning in the 40s, vaccines for these kids. So to me, it's not just there are no graves. There's none of the ghost stories about residential schools are true. The teachers did their best in almost every case, and many kids said it was a very happy experience for them.
And if I could just add a little bit to Jim's comments there, no one is denying that, there were children who were sexually abused in various contexts. There was, could be physical abuse. This is teachers and so on who could have personality defects, just like all people have personality defects in various contexts. But just going at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which I've been looking at in a detailed way over the last few weeks, just again, going back into the records, they had a swimming pool. They had a large swimming pool. It was, the first of its kind in a school. They had a dance troupe that toured the province. They had 3 Aboriginal teachers who were on staff in that period where they were saying all these children were murdered. And it just doesn't make any sense that would have happened at that residential school. So that's what we have to get to the bottom of. And it's very important. It's very urgent now, because we've now had 4 years of falsehoods that have been perpetuated. And if we can't get this straightened out this year, to get some people to have a reckoning, to figure out what actually happened at Kamloops and how did things go so far off the rails, we're never going to be able to have a foundation of truth from which to try to figure out how to create a better society for all people. And what we heard originally when the Kamloops announcement was made was how traumatized Aboriginal people were after hearing that these children had been buried at this school. If this were the case, if this is true, that they were feeling huge amounts of grief and trauma, wouldn't it be a good idea to try to figure out whether that actually happened or not? Shouldn't that be something that we're doing as a Canadian society, to try to figure out, instead of trying to charge people with residential school denialism and put them in jail for asking perfectly rational questions about what happened at that school?
Yeah, and it seems as though, like, the more you ask questions about topics like this, the more it makes more sense to see that there's a political agenda behind it, because it's like, it makes a lot more sense if it's like they're trying to scare the crap out of everybody. They're trying to use Indigenous issues as a wedge or the tip of a spear. And that'll probably come up in your documentary. The what's the group of legislation? It's like UN DRIP, is it? UNDRIP?
Yeah. UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And actually, Michelle Stirling has written quite a lot on this subject. But this is now breaking in British Columbia. There's a recognition that this is going to 200 Aboriginal groups are claiming sovereignty in British Columbia. If there is no sovereignty in British Columbia, there is no way to have a final decision made about things like what development should proceed, what should be done with Crown lands, which is public lands, which all British Columbians benefit from. And that really is the end game of much of this, is to get people to feel compassion for Aboriginal people, which we should feel like everyone should be feeling compassion for Aboriginal people, but we shouldn't allow the Aboriginal industry, the lawyers and consultants who are making money off that, to use this compassion to push through incredibly divisive and irrational pieces of legislation, which are going to destroy the ability of people to work together in the province of British Columbia.
No, absolutely. And as a reminder, this topic is very important for multiple reasons. It's become a free speech issue because they're tabling legislation to criminalize residential school denialism. Obviously, it undermines Canadian identity. And as we're pointing out now, it looks like they're trying to use it as a tip of the spear to push more sort of thinly veiled authoritarian legislation. So if you want to correct the record on this and help these brave Canadians shed light on the actual truth, there is a link in the nest here to the GoFundMe for the Grave Error documentary. If you're watching on YouTube, the link is in the description, but just as a reminder. And so let's get Simon or Michelle on the mic, but I do want to be respectful of time. Jim, like if you want to drop out at 8:00, that's fine. Or, we would like to, have you as long as you'd like, but, how long can you stick around?
I can stay. And it's very funny that you said that, because in about an hour and a half time, I'm being interviewed by somebody else. So it doesn't happen every day. It's just happening tonight. But I'm certainly available for another, almost 2 hours, but I may step out before, just before 8 o'clock your time.
All right. Perfect. Thanks. Who do you think we should go to next here, Francis?
Maybe Michelle, since I brought Michelle up as the UNDRIP. She has done research on that, but I'm sure Michelle is probably going to want to talk about her documentary that is exposing the supposed documentary, the bit Sugarcane, which was put up for an Academy Award.
Oh, wow. Michelle, can you hit unmute? Michelle, are you there? Michelle Stirling. Look for the microphone icon and just tap on that. Click on that to unmute yourself. Maybe we should go to Simon in the meantime while Michelle is trying to figure out some of her... Oh, wait.
Hello.
Unmute yourself.
Oh, there she is.
Hello, Michelle.
Hello, am I here?
You are.
Yeah, we can hear you. Maybe we should go to Simon in the meantime while Michelle is trying to figure out some of her... Oh, wait. Hello, Michelle. All right, I just muted everybody. So just Michelle, unmute yours again and continue speaking. I just want to make sure see where the feedback is coming from there. Oh, and now she's a listener. I'll go here. Let's go to Simon.
There we go. I think I'm here now.
Okay. Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you for having me on this important roundtable. Thank you, Francis, and thank you, Greg. I just want to give people a bit of background. I'm not an academic. In the 1980s, I did a series of documentaries in Calgary with CTV. And Dr. Hugh Dempsey, who was then the curator of the Glenbow Museum, was my research supervisor. He was married to Pauline Gladstone, who just recently passed away, sadly. And she was the daughter of Senator James Gladstone. So he wrote many books and articles on the early days in the West, and was very close to people who had been either at Treaty 7 or within that proximity. So I interviewed several hundred people in those documentaries. It wasn't specifically on residential schools, but some of the things that I did learn about at the time was about tuberculosis and how devastating it was, smallpox, Spanish flu. So when I first heard of the mass graves claim, that's the first thing that sprang to mind, that someone might have found a mass grave, because at the times when many people died in quick succession, there just simply wasn't enough manpower to dig individual graves, although they did try to document who's who. But these are very, very traumatic epidemics that passed through Canada and the world. There's actually a new book out called Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. And though his statistics about Canadian tuberculosis deaths at residential schools are way off, wildly exaggerated, the book does give a good perspective on how impactful it was. And there's another PBS documentary I recommend people watch. It's called The Forgotten Plague. So first of all, I would like to address the question of why is it that some people are certain. I believe there are many Indigenous people, and probably quite a few non-Indigenous as well, who are certain that there were children who were missing. And I think one of the best references is in Eric Bay's book about the Anglican schools. And he tells a story of Fort Albany. Now, a fur trader came into the Hudson Bay Company trading post. He was sick, and he said that his wife was sick in a tent with the children, and they had no food, and he then died. So the Hudson Bay Company sent out a couple of fellows with food. When they got to the tent, they found that the mother, in fact, had died. There was a 2-month-old baby. There were 3 small children, about ages 2 up to, 2, 3, 5. And there was a 16-year-old boy. So they sent the 16-year-old boy off with other relatives on a hunt. They gave the 2-month-old baby to another relative, and they took the 3 small children to an Indian residential school. So you can imagine that in that community, that day, a whole family completely was wiped out as a family, and those 3 children went away and would never have come home again, because there were no family to receive them. There were no parents to receive them. So who knows where the parents were buried? Who knows what the 16-year-old would have remembered, other than the fact that they took away his siblings and he never saw them again? Who knows what the baby grew up understanding or hearing from the adoptive family, which was a relative, of course. So, I think that this is where these kind of knowings come from. And there's another thing I'd like to talk about from a paper by Moffat et al. I think it was 2013. And this was talking about TB sanatoriums. And today people don't realize that back in the day, tuberculosis was the kiss of social death. Like once they realized in the late 1800s that TB was not hereditary, but it was actually contagious, then, if someone in your family was identified as having TB, then, you might get kicked out of your rental apartment, you might lose your job, so there were many efforts made to hide the fact that somebody in the family had TB. It was a very serious social problem and still is today. There's still a huge stigma attached to it. Anyway, Moffat writes about an Indigenous family who said that their brother went to the TB sanatorium when he was 7 years old. He didn't come home until he was 13 years old. Nobody saw him in that period of time. So when he came back, of course, he didn't speak the language anymore. He had no idea what the customs were anymore. And all these people, there were new children in the family who never even knew he existed. So, for the people in the community, it would be as if that 7-year-old had in fact disappeared. And probably he was sent from the Indian residential school on to the TB sanatorium, because many of the children who went to these schools, in fact, I think Dr. Peter Bryce wrote that 93% of the children who were admitted were carrying TB. And you can carry it and not have it active in your body. But, it can progress. And then if it became active, they would be sent on to a TB sanatorium. The family would not see their child for, 6 or 7 years. Anyway, so you can see where these senses of missing children come from. So there is some validity to this idea of it, but the actual reality is much different than what people think. And you have to remember that only 1/3 of status Indians went to residential school. 1/3 went to day school on reserve, which is like an ordinary public school where you'd go home at night. And 1/3 went to no school at all. So you can imagine that those who did not go to school at all would, certainly conjure up explanations. And that also leads us to the next story that I'd like to talk about, and that would be the film Sugarcane. So I have a background in making films and writing screenplays, and I began to wonder what was going on. What was going on with Sugarcane, because I saw that it was being very heavily promoted last summer. And I thought, well, that's odd. And then I happened to be able to see it twice in a row. And it was not shown in very many theaters. It just kind of skipped across the country, one showing here or there at film festivals. And all of the film critics had this one particular view, that the film, they said for sure that the film showed that the lead character, Ed Archie Noisecat, was the product of a woman who had been raped by a priest, and that he was the only baby to have survived the incinerator at St. Joseph's residential school at the Williams Lake First Nation. So that sounded pretty wild to me, because as most people know, there are the 10 commandments, and one of them is thou shalt not kill. So, it's hard to believe that priests and nuns who dedicated their lives to thousands of Indigenous people across Canada, who went through the worst extremes of this country in a time when it was very difficult to survive, just in order to try and uplift these people. It's very difficult for me to believe that they intentionally had priests raping and burning babies, unwanted babies. But there is one element of truth, and that is that there was a Father O'Connor at St. Joseph's who had an affair with Phyllis Bobb. Now, Phyllis Bobb was a 22-year-old seamstress, so she wasn't a student anymore. And likewise, in the film Sugarcane, there's a very brief encounter with a Williams Lake Tribune story from 1959 about this woman who went to jail for a year. Why? Because she delivered her baby alone at St. Joseph's in the summer of that year. And thinking that the baby was dead, that's what she told the court, she put him in the incinerator. Now, what happened is Antonius Stoop, the dairyman, came home late that night from a Knights of Columbus meeting in Williams Lake. He heard curious sounds in the incinerator outside. He looked inside thinking there was a cat trapped in there somehow, and found the baby and took it back to the hospital and saved Ed Archie Noisecat's life. So this Williams Lake Tribune story is in the film. And this was the thing that really twigged me when I was watching the film, because it said the mother was 20. Well, children were only allowed to go to school at an Indian residential school until they were 16 years old. So obviously she was an adult. And then it turns out that Julian Brave Noisecat, who is a co-director of the film and son of Ed Archie Noisecat and grandson of Antoinette Archie, the woman who put Ed in the incinerator, it turns out that he'd even written about the fact that actually his father, Ed Archie Noisecat, was the son of Ray Peters, who was a rodeo rider who had 8 children with Antoinette and fathered 17 children in total. He was a bit of a tomcat. So, now this completely changes the story. So it wasn't a priest. It can't be a priest because actually Ed Archie Noisecat claims his Indigenous carving heritage from his father, Ray Peters, and grandfather, Chief Harry Peters of the Lil'wat Nation. So you see, none of these facts are explored within the documentary Sugarcane, even though that one document is displayed in the film. So after that, Nina Green, who's a really wonderful researcher.
Sorry, Michelle. Sorry to cut you off. What document specifically is in the film?
This document is the Williams Lake Tribune news article from 1959.
Which refers to the incident with the incinerator, or?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
It gives the details, but it doesn't give the name of the woman. So anyway, Nina Green started doing some research and found all of these details that I've just told you. And then, the two of us started putting together a low-budget documentary rebuttal. And so you can see that on my Substack. I have a Substack called Sorry No More, Exposing the Bitter Roots of Sugarcane. And that's what I called the low-budget documentary, mini documentary, The Bitter Roots of Sugarcane. Because, one of the ironies of it is that a woman named Charlene Beaulieu was in the film. And in 1993, she testified to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People that she had been orphaned when her alcoholic father had had a car accident and died, and gone to the school. And she said that she had a good experience, that her mother and grandmother had gone to the school and they both had good experiences, though she knew that others had bad experiences. But now, many years later, she's claiming that babies were incinerated by priests who are raping young girls and blah, 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 and claiming that we knew this was happening. We told you, now we have the proof. Well, there is no proof in the documentary Sugarcane. It's all innuendo. And I must say, one thing I find very interesting as a filmmaker, British Columbia has excellent filmmakers. But for this film, they brought in a whole cadre of outsiders, probably because people who work in Vancouver and who have made films all over the province would have quite a few questions about this thesis of priests incinerating babies.
Yes. And Michelle, I just wanted to ask you a question about that, the incinerating of babies assertion, which I should mention has now become widespread. So Sugarcane was where we saw that being made the most public, in the sense that this is a mass documentary that a lot of people are watching. But in the Kamloops case, we have heard numerous Aboriginal leaders claim about the incinerators at the Kamloops case, two of them being Jeanette Jules, who is a major figure at Kamloops, and as well Gary Godfredson, who is a poet and also on staff at Thompson Rivers University. Both of them are making claims about the incinerators and burning of babies. And this is also the claim of Terry Teague, who is the head of the British Columbia Association, Assembly of First Nations British Columbia branch. I just wanted to get your thoughts. Where does this come from, this idea that priests and nuns are incinerating babies? Because if I know anything about the Catholic religion, which is not much, that would be a terrible sin if you were incinerating babies. So that would be a highly improbable circumstance. What do you think that comes from, that idea of the incineration of babies?
Well, if you look at the Grey Nun's diaries, you can see that back in the day, even infanticide and cannibalism was part of life of a subsistence tribe. And when the Grey Nuns came to the Northwest, one of the first things they began doing was adopting these orphaned children so that they wouldn't be put in that situation, or bringing in, any child or person that was about to be abandoned. You can read their rather grisly references written at the time, and understand that this probably is, part of the folklore of the tribes themselves. You can also understand this idea that in the summer, let's say you have some nice young women, they see a handsome rodeo rider like, let's say, Ray Peters. They have a good time together, whether by coercion or whether just having fun, normal human sexual relations. They go back to school in the fall, so that would be 2 months later. Most women don't start to show that they're pregnant until they're about 3 or 4 months along, 5 months along. And so in the case of St. Joseph's, they were sent on to Vancouver to a home for unwed mothers. But you can understand that the scuttlebutt back in the reserve would be, we sent this young woman to Indian residential school, and she became pregnant there. That would be the conclusion, when in fact it was far more likely, like in the case of Annette, that it was, some handsome young rodeo fellow.
I should mention the work of Kevin Annett.
Mm-hmm.
So in case people do not know the work of Kevin Annett, it's possible that some of this could be due to his books and pieces that he posts on the internet. Kevin Annett made the claim of incinerators, babies being incinerated by priests, and Kevin Annett had quite open hostility. He was a minister. He was a United Church minister in, I believe, Port Alberni, and he had a grievance. He had a lot of grievances against religious institutions. Befriended Billy Coombs, who is the man who claimed that Queen Elizabeth II had abducted 10 children from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Anyway, the idea of incinerated babies looms large in the work of Kevin Annett, and I'm wondering whether his work has been absorbed by Indigenous people who went to residential schools and so on.
Well, I'm sure it has done, because, it's a fairly small community. And so this kind of storytelling at powwows and such like would probably have proliferated. There's another woman that Lloyd Hawkeye Robertson introduced us to in his work about residential school syndrome, because he does agree that many people who went to residential school have sort of a form of PTSD, which he's written a paper about it. But in that paper, there's another psychologist, Indigenous psychologist in the States, who he refers to, Braveheart. I can't remember her full name, but she asks people to imagine themselves in a Holocaust or in some kind of crisis, horrible torture situation, which is basically sort of imparting memories that don't exist to someone, as far as I'm concerned. And I think also there's a role that psychologists in general have played in this, where just like in the case of the Satanic Panic in Saskatchewan in the 1990s, it's quite easy to lead people or to put ideas in their head so that they remember things that never happened, or never happened quite as described. And this is the view of David Raskin, who's an American psychologist who was called to testify in that Satanic Panic case. So I think that, it's, as I said in the beginning, there is some validity to this idea that people went missing. And you can just imagine if you were an orphan child. Like, I've seen a video interview with a woman that's posted on Jaguar Bird's YouTube channel. And this woman is saying, I was taken away from my grandfather when I was 6, and along with my sister, and my brother had to stay behind. He was too young, and it sounds terrible. And then they say, well, didn't your parents object? And she's like, well, my parents had died. My grandmother had died. My grandfather was taking care of the 4 of us and 9 others. So she herself was apparently not even aware of what that meant for an elderly person back in like the 1950s, I imagine, 40s, where people would have been destitute. Imagine taking care of 13 children yourself today. It would have been impossible. So, of course, people were given away in that way. They were given up for care. That because, as Robert Carney, he was a historian and also the father of Mark Carney, our new prime minister, as he wrote, you know, that these were the medical and social services hub, the Indian residential schools. So people of all kinds went to them for help of all different natures, and they gave whatever help they could. So you can imagine, though, an orphan going to a school, their parents having just died, and perhaps dying of TB, which is a horrible thing. You know, usually people cough up blood and then they start uncontrollably coughing. There's blood everywhere, and then they die right in front of you. You know, so you can imagine if you were an orphan child being taken to this totally new place, your parents having just died, you wouldn't have that closure. You would have this ambiguous loss that you would carry with you for the rest of your life, depending on, you know, your ability to mentally adapt. So, and I think all of this death cult, I call it, is exacerbated today by the ongoing tragedy of the unbelievable number of opioid deaths and alcohol deaths and suicides. I mean, you know, life on reserve in most cases is really a tragedy. And, you know, blaming Indian residential schools is not going to address this tragedy, but the sort of death cult, the hope for graves, the mass graves, this kind of psychological imagery somehow probably mixes well with the tragedies that are going on today. It kind of makes sense of them, even though you can't make sense of them.
As well, I think we should not fail to mention the Aboriginal industry, which is the lawyers and consultants who work for Aboriginal organizations. They perpetuate these ideas because they are trying to extract various forms of what is called rent, which can either be compensation or various financial transactions. And the more you can claim that it was the responsibility of the churches, the governments, so on, the more lawsuits can be filed and the more money can be diverted to Aboriginal organizations. And of course, this money which is distributed does not benefit the opioid addicted and the fetal alcohol syndrome, you know, kind of plagued population, which needs serious intervention and some kind of thoughts as to how to deal with these state of emergency conditions which exist in Aboriginal communities. But anyway, Michelle, I think that's very interesting, all your work, but I was wondering if we might want to bring in Simon.
But before we move to Simon, I just wanted to hop in real quick. Thank you for that, Michelle. Yeah. I shared a few of your tweets in the Nest, specifically about the Sugarcane documentary and your rebuttal. There's actually a link to the Vimeo in a tweet in the chat there. I believe I also found the newspaper clipping you're talking about that says "Newborn Babe Saved from Garbage Burner," and kind of tells the story of how this baby was abandoned there. But so you guys can check that out. And I also did link to one of your Substacks about tuberculosis and how that's a major kind of factor in a lot of this sort of rewriting of history when it comes to the Indigenous and residential schools. But before we go to Simon, I thought, you know, we were talking about all these sort of falsehoods and burning babies, priests burning babies, apparently. I'm curious, Jim, if you wanted to hop in and share any comments, Mr. McMurtry, on this topic before we move on to Simon.
Well, there's a lot to say. I must admit I'm still charmed, tantalized listening to Michelle and Frances. I think they're incredible women. So there's nothing that they haven't said that I probably wanted to say. But if I could just point out one thing in particular, and that is said, I provide the dimension of being an educator. And I want to get people to just maybe think for a moment what it's like for children children generally. Michelle was talking about the trauma that all children, certainly Indigenous children, would have experienced living on reserves 100, 150 years ago. But even children in schools today, there are a lot of them that are dealing with trauma, that are dealing with things that are very sad, whether it's divorce, whether it's coming from a country, whether it's war, whether it's someone dying in the family, cancer, whatever it is. There's a lot of things. So one of the things that we shouldn't lose sight of when we live in a society where everybody is perpetuating the darkest of lies, that Murray Sinclair estimated up to 25,000 children disappeared, or as Kimberly Murray said, the special interlocutor, is that these children, as many as 25,000 Indigenous children at residential schools were disappeared. Of course, none of that's true, but what effect does that have on children, particularly small children? And there's so many rituals at schools. It's not just Orange Shirt Day. It's so many events through the year, every school year, where they do one exercise or another. The one school near me, teacher said to me the other day that all their professional development for this whole school year has been about Indigenous stuff. And every single time it's just, again, about how atrocious people were to Indigenous people. I think it must be particularly hard to be an Indigenous child in the school system and to be repeatedly told, because land acknowledgements are daily. And at my last school, there was always about not only genocide in the past, but an ongoing genocide against Indigenous people in Canada. What kind of effect does this have on children? So this is why it's so absolutely essential, as it's framed here by Francis in the title of this meeting this evening, 4 years of deception. This deception has to end, because what we're doing is we're victimizing a whole generation of children who are viewing our ancestors as monsters and are looking at adults thinking, imagining the capacity they too may have for doing something horrific toward them. So anyhow, that's it.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that perspective too, because these people who are pushing this narrative, they also do this ironic thing where they say that they want to stop hate and that they want to stop all this evil things happening. And it's like, well, maybe you shouldn't continually try to demonize all white Canadians in our entire history. Because when you do that, you're going to obviously get people hating one another when you start to mischaracterize broadly, paint with these broad brushstrokes as if, any white Canadian person is responsible, or any Christian or Catholic in Canada is responsible for, burning children alive and fill in the other horrific blanks. If you really cared about stopping hate, you would want people to know the truth and be able to sift into the nuance of, the tough times that were part of our history, the good and the bad, instead of kind of just creating this crazy caricature. But as a reminder to correct the record, let me just grab my soapbox for a quick minute. It's great to have all these people together talking about this, because this is very, almost, I would argue, an existential thing, because this directly relates to Canadian identity, Canadian history. And I really think that the nation is sort of in a crisis right now, especially because this honest conversation about the actual truth doesn't permeate the mainstream, doesn't permeate even the mainstream parties. Not even the Conservative Party will touch this. They are a party that agreed that residential schools are genocide. And it's up to us, is the point. It's up to us to correct the record. It's up to us to push this conversation. And I want to draw attention again to the documentary, the Grave Error documentary that Francis Widdowson is fundraising for. The link is there at the GoFundMe in the Nest. The link is in the description on YouTube. Speaking of which, I think we're going to introduce... Oh, no. Did he duck out? Did Simon duck out?
He's shy.
Uh-oh. We were going to throw it to Simon, who is the filmmaker who's going to be helping you with this project. Let's wait around until Simon comes back. But Francis, maybe you could kind of talk a little bit more about the project.
Sure, yes. And so Simon Hergott, if he's around, um, he's an incredible videographer who used to work for Global News and other media outlets for over a decade and had terrible problems working for these media organizations because of the fact that they've been captured largely what I understand, like I think wokeism, which is identity politics that has become totalitarian. I'm not using it as a pejorative. I'm trying to explain this phenomenon that we encounter all the time. And Greg was just saying about the hate that is being perpetuated by all of these arguments. But I was going to say, Greg, hate is not being opposed. It's hating what is considered to be the it is the idea that you cannot have any criticism of representatives of groups perceived to be oppressed, because then it is believed that people will start to hate those people. It's fine to hate people who are perceived to be oppressors. So that's kind of the important distinction in this, what would be called woke ideology. But in terms of the media's problems, which is really quite shocking, the fact that we had this false statement made by the Kamloops band, it was not a mistake. For many months afterwards, we thought, well, maybe they just misunderstood GPR, the purpose of GPR, which is not to find remains. GPR finds soil disturbances, which could be cobbles, it could be animal burrows, it could be a huge number of things. And when they excavated the Pine Creek, which is in Saskatchewan,
Manitoba.
They found, sorry, I thought it was in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Thank you so much. My geography is terrible. They found rocks. When they actually, elders, the so-called knowledge keepers, believed people were buried in the basement of this church. They spent the money to bring in the forensic people to sift through all the dirt, and they found rocks. That GPR cannot tell the difference between rocks and remains. And we should mention in the Kamloops case that we had the number 215 originally, and that got downgraded in July 2021 to 200 because Sarah Bollier, who was the so-called GPR expert, who is not an expert, she's not a geophysicist, she's some kind of conflict anthropologist with a GPR machine. She found out after the fact that the archaeology department at Simon Fraser had done some shovel test pits in that area where she had found these anomalies. And so she downgraded her findings to 200. So this was kind of a mistake perhaps initially, but then we found out in July that it was 200 targets of interest, and the band continues to make arguments about children being buried there, remains being found, unmarked graves. This was a carefully orchestrated attempt to mislead the public. And what Simon found is when he was a journalist working in British Columbia, his employers with the corporate media had no interest whatsoever in trying to get to the bottom of this story. And so what it's left up to now is we can't rely on these traditional institutions to tell the truth. We need to rely upon people who are not affiliated with any of these corporate entities. And that falls to people like Simon and me, who we have no connections to any corporate interests, any types of entities that could control the coverage. So that, of course, makes us reliant on the public to help us to create something which has the potential to put us on a more accurate and democratic foundation. Because if we are not able to have a reckoning at Kamloops and find out exactly what happened there, there is just going to be more attempts to push through this false and divisive agenda, which
Could I
is masterminded by a number of entities.
just add something there, Francis?
Yes, go ahead.
I think one of the things that people don't realize that happened with this GPR search, this was announced over a long weekend. Now, no one, as far as we can understand, no one did any research on previous land use. And Nina Green has done a whole thing on her Kamloops website page. She has a whole website that looks at residential schools. It has all the death certificates that talks in detail, but she's referring to it's under Indian Residential School Records.com, Kamloops, and she's referring to some work by a person who goes by a pseudonym of Cam Rez, who did previous land use record research and found that actually right under where the claim is that all these mass graves are, just happens to be 2,000 feet of septic trenches that were dug in the 1920s. So that would create these kind of repetitive patterns that Sarah Beaulieu understood to be repetitive patterns of graves. I believe she even said that they were facing in the east-west configuration consistent with Christianity, which, you know, when you think about it, if you got priests and nuns out in the middle of the night with 6-year-old kids burying children as young as 3 in clandestine burials after they just murdered them, why would they care about what configuration these alleged graves would be, right? So anyway, that's a very basic research requirement. You know, it's a basic research requirement that's very similar to the bitter roots of sugarcane, where the sugarcane filmmakers used that Williams Lake Tribune article in their paper to support their contention. But they obviously they never read it or they willfully misused it. Same thing here with Kamloops, where, you know, no one did any previous land use review and no one ever said, look, these results are extremely preliminary. You know, no one should ever have released it to the press, actually. But as mentioned before, this is the trigger that pushed UNDRIP through. And you have to remember that 6 premiers and several First Nations were completely opposed to UNDRIP. They wanted a lot of changes. They wanted to know what consent actually meant. Was it retroactive? How would this impact resource and energy development? You know, whose rights were what? So because it was COVID lockdowns during that spring period, they hadn't been able to meet and discuss these things and negotiate changes to UNDRIP once this claim, atrocity propaganda of mass graves, was published around the world. And curiously, no journalists asked any questions. Once it was published, then UNDRIP was pushed through. And you know, we've heard a lot lately from Sam Cooper and Jason James of Brave New Normal on the Chinese infiltration in Canada. It's very interesting that the day after UNDRIP received royal assent, China accused Canada of genocide against Indigenous people at the UN, backed by a number of other despot nations. And they used Kamloops as the example. And the person who brought that interesting tidbit forward is Terry Glavin in The Year of the Graves.
Yes, and that was one of the first breakthroughs in Canada, was Terry Glavin writing the piece in the National Post. And I just wanted to echo Michelle Stirling's comments about Nina Green. I didn't want to mention Nina Green's name because I know she's a very kind of guarded person, but I just cannot help myself because I think Nina's research is just absolutely incredible. And it's allowed, you know, over 10 researchers to do the work that we do. And her website, if people are interested in her website, which is residentialschoolrecords.com, you can find, you know, the massive amounts of work that she's done on this file. But I just wanted to mention about the GPR, which is where we all went wrong on this. Not all of us. Like, there's many of us who were very skeptical about these claims to begin with. But one thing we weren't sure about is, was that an abandoned cemetery in the Kamloops Indian Residential School? We weren't completely informed about this, because what's happened is there's many cemeteries across the country, the most important one being Cowessess, which was the announcement shortly after the Kamloops case of supposedly 751 unmarked graves, which Cadmus Delorum, who is the chief of that band, said was a crime scene, when he knew very well that that was an abandoned cemetery, and it wasn't even an Indigenous cemetery. It was a cemetery that was attached to the parish, where you had a hospital where people died in the hospital, and you had both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people buried in that cemetery. And that was the site where Prime Minister Trudeau went and knelt over a teddy bear, and Jagmeet Singh went and did a huge emotional kind of statement about how this was evidence of genocide. These politicians should hang their heads in shame for what they have done. They need to retract everything that they have stated about this, because this was a completely manufactured thing, which had nothing to do with anything about murders or mass graves or genocide. They were using it purely for political points, and I think that was a complete disgrace.
Yes, and may I add something here?
Yes.
Well, regarding people putting down teddy bears or kneeling with teddy bears and all the little displays of shoes, Calgary, where Francis and I are,
this guy has me blocked.
Calgary,
I don't know who this is.
Memorial
he has me blocked for some reason.
The Confluence, which
so
was
weird.
Formerly Fort Calgary. And remember that the Mounties came west and stopped the actual genocide of the Blackfoot Nation by American whiskey traders, for which Crowfoot was very happy, and he signed Treaty 7 because of that, because he was so grateful to them. But anyway, they're planning on taking all these plastic shoes that were made in China probably by Uyghur slaves who are facing a real genocide. They're planning on sort of bronzing them all, and also the teddy bears that were part of the display at Calgary City Hall. Now, the thing is, teddy bears were created in honor of Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States. He went on a hunting trip, and he wanted to get a bear, and he couldn't get one, but some fellow found a bear, tied it up to a tree, and said, "There, now you can shoot the bear." And he declined, saying that he didn't think that was sportsmanlike. So this person made a teddy bear in his honor for being such a great guy. But Theodore Roosevelt actually hated Native people and had very ill will toward them, and wanted them dead. This was entirely in opposition to the view of the Canadian public toward Native people. We have been economic trade partners for 300 or 400 years here in this country, and the Mounties came west to protect the Native people from the Indian Wars in the States, which had been raging from 1644 to 1924. So in 1924, children had been at Indian residential schools in Canada learning how to read and write and operate in modern day society. And in the States, the cavalry was still running them down and gunning them down in Indian Wars. So, very, very different histories. But the point is, the teddy bear is probably the absolute worst symbol that anybody could think of for this scenario. And it only shows you how poor the history is on the part of politicians and all the Indigenous activists.
As I was looking for the tweet of Trudeau kneeling, I thought it was interesting because I found a whole bunch of him kneeling for BLM as well. Remember when he did that whole display kneeling for BLM, which again probably only raises tensions between groups. But he said it's just such like perfect news speak, double speak language. It's hard to find the words that are enough, but to all those affected, know that I am here as your partner to walk the path of reconciliation and right these historical wrongs. You know, it's such twisted language. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there.
You know, I know that we don't want to be partisan about this matter here, because the Conservatives were just as bad. Like Aaron O'Toole was the leader at the time, and the embarrassing things that he said in the House of Commons, even bringing his son into the whole thing about how his son had asked him about this. And it was just, the whole thing is a complete failure of any kind of responsible types of ways of examining this. And there's a lot of blame to go around in terms of all the institutions, but we can correct it. Like, this is the kind of the key thing, is that we are, you know, lurching forward into the future with not being tethered to reality in any way. And the time is now to do that. We can do it now. We can say, hey, everyone kind of lost their heads a bit here. It's easy to get swept up in the emotions of the time, but now we know it was a huge deception. So we can, you know, put our hands up and say enough. We need to have, I don't know what it's going to take to have a review of the massive failure of all these institutions. But most importantly, I think is at the roots of a lot of this is the destruction of the idea of truth, which has been happening for decades. And this is what Dallas Brody got in trouble for when she was saying in a somewhat sort of sarcastic tone, it's not your truth, it's not my truth, it's not your grandmother's truth, it's just the truth. Although the tone that she used there might have been, you know, we can take issue with, but those words are exactly correct. Your grandmother might believe for their safety or their love, but that is not the truth. And everything that is what we are all trying to figure out. And we need a universal understanding. And if we don't have that, we have lost our ability to act democratically in Canadian society.
Very well said, Francis. And that's why this documentary is so important, you know, to correct the record, to have a common view on reality where we actually interrogate the facts. You know, like, this is what academics are supposed to do. And as I said, it's going to be up to people like us to uphold a sort of, like, you know, a rigorousness to upholding what actually happened. And once again, the link is the GoFundMe is in the nest there to support funding this grave error documentary. Sorry, Michelle, you were going to say something?
I was. You know, one thing I would like to talk about, if I may, I don't know how time is for people.
So I was thinking we'll keep waiting for Simon, but I was thinking maybe we could either have some closing statements soon, or maybe we could throw to some questions from the audience to listeners. What do you think, Francis?
I think questions from the audience would be great. If Michelle, if you just have a quick point that you want to say, and then we can go to questions from the audience.
So guys, start requesting to speak if you have a question.
So one thing that I would like to bring up is that people like myself often say, okay, there's no list of names of missing children. But recently you may have seen the news that said that the O'Nabegan family in Ontario has found the remains of a long lost, what would have been uncle to the woman Claire O'Nabegan, and that they have exhumed his body from a place near Woodstock, and they're bringing him home to the Long Lake number 58 reserve and repatriating him. So the story goes that he was either 6 or 8 years old. They claim that he was forced to go to an Indian residential school, although he was allegedly partially paralyzed and epileptic, and that from there he was taken away by the government, disappeared by the government to various other institutions, and ultimately he died at age 27 in a facility like that near Woodstock and was buried there without notification to the family. So they found part of this through the research of Kimberly Murray, who was the special interlocutor on missing children and unmarked graves related to Indian residential schools. But what has happened, and this is thanks to the detailed research of Nina Green, what has happened is actually Percy Nabigan died at 3.5 months old on the reserve. He's buried on the reserve. He actually died in hospital of pneumococcal meningitis that was exacerbated by what's called marasmic, meaning marasmus. It means extreme malnutrition. So this family was living in absolute poverty. The father at one point went to a TB sanatorium, as did one of the sons. And so basically they have dug up the remains of someone else with a slightly different name. But this example will be used as an example of a missing child that was disappeared by the government. And when I say disappeared, I mean as if in a military junta, like in Argentina or Guatemala, where there was civil war and people were literally stripped from their bed in the middle of the night and no one ever saw them again. But in those cases, the mothers and sisters and brothers would stand with pictures of the person, their name, their date of birth, where they were taken from. We have none of that kind of evidence in this phantom genocide in Canada. So I just wanted to mention that because it's a very important kind of turning point in this whole story, because it will be used to claim from now on that any Indigenous person who went to not only a residential school, but to an Indian hospital, a mental institute, a home for the disabled, TB sanatorium, that their remains should also be repatriated and Canadian taxpayers should pay for it, even though for the past 100 years, no one's ever gone looking for these people and no one ever cared. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that story. And I think it is worth mentioning that, you know, there is a pretty long history of RCMP corruption throughout history. So it's like, I think even more important is, you know, to recount history, to separate the truth from the bullshit, because there probably is some horrible things that have happened. And, you know, if it's like the boy who cried wolf, you know, it's like, if you're going to say that this was bad and that was bad, and like, it's a bunch of fabricated stories, that kind of ignore really important facts like tuberculosis, like that makes, you know, potential RCMP corruption where maybe they did, you know, make certain indigenous women disappear. You know, like that almost like discounts the real stuff. That's probably not the most eloquent way to put it, but yeah, I think I just brought up Nuala. Nuala, would you like to ask any of the panel members a question or anything to add to the discussion?
For now, I'd like to just make a note on some housekeeping for the fundraiser. With GoFundMe, you have the option to turn off tip so that you're not charged more than your donation. So just make sure that if you don't want to give GoFundMe a tip, to just slide over that green bar towards the left.
Amazing. Thank you for that. That's fantastic. Again, the GoFundMe is in the nest there to support the Grave Error documentary. Again, if you guys want to ask any questions, then be sure to request to speak, and we'll get you up here.
I have a question for the panel.
Sure.
If anyone wants to elaborate on some of the social damage that has affected Canada. I mean, we have our domestic social damage, and you know, we have our international reputation as well. So what kind of things have you seen that like affect even our everyday lives that has been social damage caused by this? And of course, it's Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people who are suffering because of this narrative like Francis said, that there's Aboriginal people who felt traumatized, had grief. And now we also have non-Aboriginal children like going to school and being forced to wear orange shirts, and which is a form of conformity training. In jobs, it becomes like a struggle session that you have to wear the orange shirt, these sorts of things. What else? What other ways that have you seen social damage from this?
I wouldn't mind taking a quick stab at that, saying to you that I have a number of grandchildren. One of them just turned 3, and his daycare read from a book. And there's so many books, in not just in schools now, but in daycares that present obviously the darkest, the most dystopian image of Canadian society. But he came home and he said he learned about residential schools and how the children all had their hair cut. So the idea that educators are getting away with, and when I say educators, we're talking about more than 100,000 people in Canada, are getting away, and of course it'd be double that if we added all the people working in daycares. They're getting away with frightening children. So it's not just a question of misinforming children about our past. It's taking small children and traumatizing them. So if anyone here, or if anyone anywhere wants to say it was awful for children in residential schools because in part some were traumatized with the experience, and I think that's very much exaggerated, but there certainly would have been some trauma. Why reproduce that trauma today with all school children? So as we see with the gender cult, the gender ideology, it wasn't being done with high school students, where there is a little bit more strength and ability to critically process what is being told. But if you're dealing with 6-year-olds, or in the case of my grandson, and 3-year-olds, they have no ability to process this. So I think the darkness has to come to an end. And I think an awful lot of people, not just people in media and people in government and higher up in our institutions, I think every single person that peddles these dark fairy tales has to stop now.
Yes, I'd like to add to that, if I may. I'm putting out a tweet here related to Rod Clifton and Mark DeWolf's co-edited book, From Truth Comes Reconciliation. And Rodney Clifton actually worked in a Indian residential school up north, and he explained, why were kids given a number? Well, because they had individual clothes assigned to them with numbers, and he spent a lot of his time in the laundry room sorting these clothes. And why was their hair cut? Because a lot of kids who over the summer lived out on the land, didn't have showers, didn't have baths. They came in with all kinds of infections and often infestations, lice and such like. And you can imagine back in the day, like today, it's pretty hard to get rid of lice, but back in the day, think of how hard it would really have been. So, and in a communal setting like a residential school, you would not want to have these kind of communicable infestations or infections running through the school. So, as unpleasant as it was, the first order of business was to get those clothes off and either get them washed, and then later they'd be returned to the kids at the end of the year, or if they were in bad shape, they'd be tossed, and get that hair cleaned up and get rid of those lice. So it's too bad. You see, that historical context is missing. So, and why would children be called, 193? Well, 193, come and get your clothes. But does it make sense to you that nuns and priests would call children by their number rather than just their name? Isn't it easier to say, okay, Jackie or Charlene, can you come up to the board in English for me? Are you going to say, 159, come up here? And, that's 3 words you have to remember. Obviously, that's ridiculous. And the whole principle of Roman Catholicism and Christianity in general is to treat people with human dignity, because, the Judeo-Christian faith believes that people are made in the image of God, that they're divine beings. And, that elevates the importance of of treating a person with dignity and respect, and likewise treating their body, their temporary house, with respect, because Christians generally believe in the resurrection. So that's why the idea of incinerating bodies and such like, or being so brutal to people would be outside of most Christian thinking.
And if I may just add something, which I'm not sure of, well, I have briefly touched upon this. I think one of the biggest tragedies of this entire episode is the distraction, the terrible distraction that's happened, which much of Aboriginal policy, why we're concerned about Aboriginal policy, is because of the terrible conditions that exist in these isolated, remote communities. The biggest secret, which people don't want to talk about, is very high rates of fetal alcohol syndrome, which mean that a whole generation of Aboriginal children are destined to not be able to thrive in society. And instead of focusing our attention on those terrible problems, we have people like Keisha Supernant and Sarah Bollier being paid thousands of dollars to pull their GPR machines all over the country, looking for non-existent missing children. Not to mention people like Kimberly Murray, the special interlocutor, whose office had a budget of millions of dollars to write an absolutely outrageous report, which castigated a whole bunch of people, including me, as being a residential school denialist who should be put in jail for my views.
Well, and not to mention, Kimberly Murray is operating from Oshwekan, which claims to be not even in Canada. It's on Mohawk territory. There's a big sign. And, so are we paying a foreign agent, is my question, to denigrate our great country? And in fact, by doing so, that simply hands China a tool to take to the UN and say, see, look at this, all these claims, they murder, incest, rape, blah, blah, blah. It's a very big question, like what's going on there with this person.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nuala, for the question. I just brought up rotoscoped rod puppet. If you have a question, sir, then let her rip. You can unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment.
Not a question, just a comment. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, sound good.
Just a comment. Jim mentioned the effect that all of this has on children. All of these stories have on children, and it just reminded me of. I'm from Manitoba. I'm from northern Manitoba, and I was at a hockey game in March, and there was an 11 or 12-year-old girl, a young girl, a Native girl, with her friends, just watching the game and running around. She was wearing a hoodie which said a genocide survivor across the front. And I thought, what an awful thing to buy a kid. Why would you put your kid in that? Why would you want your kid to think that about themselves and their family? And I wonder, what does she think when she looks at someone like me? Because I'm white. What kind of stories has she been told? I'm from northern Manitoba. I've lived pretty much my whole life. And as a white minority in a Native majority region, I have a familiarity with Native people and with Indigenous issues that most Canadians just don't have. And I think for a lot of people, residential schools is still a new or exciting or exotic topic, a very salacious topic. Well, I can tell you where I live, it's been not a weekly, but a daily topic for 20 years now. And it's done nothing. The narratives have done nothing to improve living conditions, have done nothing to improve social relations. It's just billions of dollars have been moved around to create these sort of office jobs and to further all of these ideas, which are just increasingly detached from reality. And I think Kamloops was it was a bridge too far. I think a lot of people were introduced to residential schools through the announcement from Kamloops. But I know when I heard it back in 2021, right away I thought, this is bullshit. It's ridiculous. And sure enough, it was. But just to go off of what Jim said, everything that's happened in the last 20 years, it's done nothing for relations. It's done nothing for material conditions. It's caused a lot of damage. So that's what I have to say.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Scamloops. That's the first time I've heard that one. I like that. That's catchy. And yeah, right here, I'm somebody who only first heard about the residential schools when this story broke 4 years ago. And yeah, like I've always said that the Indigenous get treated, they are the original political football. You know, they've always been like, they're always just kind of commodified, turned into a football for the political class, the ruling class, to kind of just bat around and use. Like they're the original sort of like BLM sort of, using that as a sort of a political wedge or political football to, like you said, not actually improve material conditions for the Indigenous, not actually, when they stopped the pipelines, for example, that could have enriched a lot of Indigenous communities by creating, enterprise and jobs. But I mean, that's a whole other documentary in terms of why the pipelines weren't made. But they certainly kind of weaponized the Indigenous community for that as well. But I just brought somebody else. Thank you for the comment, Rotoscoped Rod Puppet. I think I brought up Josh. Josh, how's it going? Do you have a comment or question?
Yes, thank you, Greg, and thank you for your to Francis and Michelle and Jim for hosting this excellent space. This has been very informative, and I consider it anti-algorithmic in that it's not a news story of the day, and it's still very, very important that we learn when we come on these platforms. And tonight I've definitely learned a lot. So I'm in Ontario, and parent councils at schools as of late have taken issue with saying land acknowledgement ceremonies before meetings start. And I've noticed a correlation between land acknowledgement ceremonies and these and this Kamloops situation. So if you guys want to comment on that, I also want to just mention quickly that I have seen Cadmus Delorum speak. I've also seen Negan Sinclair speak. And I just would like to know how much money these individuals are making to tour around Canada and espouse their half-truths in the way that they are. And ideally, the money that they're given to come and deliver half-truths should go back to the people on within their communities who are clearly struggling. I think it's very unfortunate when we see this sort of pyramid effect where we got guys like Cadmus and Negan getting all of this money, yet their people don't have clean drinking water and are clearly struggling as a result of this opioid crisis. So I'll land there. And thanks again, Greg, for this great space.
Thanks for the question, Josh. And before, because I see some people unmuting to answer, Francis and Michelle, could we just clarify who these two individuals are for everyone else listening? Because I'm not familiar with these two names you brought up.
Cadmus Delorum and Negan Sinclair.
Yeah.
Cadmus Delorum is the chief of the Cowessess Indian band. He was and someone did say, I noticed in the YouTube comments that he did at some point say that it was a cemetery, but that's not the first message that was put out. The first message that was put out was that it was 751 unmarked graves, which were originally marked, and then what happened is all the markers deteriorated. And so he was a big spreader of misinformation. Negan Sinclair is the son of Murray Sinclair, who is an unbelievable bad actor and professor at the University of Manitoba, who said that my firing from Mount Royal University was a Christmas gift that kept on giving, and he had a big celebration about that. The pushing out of a professor from their job for trying to speak the truth about things, that gives people a bit of an understanding of Negon Sinclair's professional ethics. Anyway, someone mentioned the gentleman, very interesting comments that he made about Manitoba, about the money that's being obtained through speaking engagements. I'm not sure. I know that Sean Carlton, who's another terrible bad actor from the University of Manitoba, says he gives all of his money to, the Survivors Society and so on. So I don't quite know. But I think the big tragedy is that Cadmus Delorme and Negon Sinclair are in the position that they are in because of the education and their ability to integrate into Canadian society. That's why they're successful. What they are advocating is for the continuous tendency and impoverishment of the marginalized Aboriginal population in these isolated communities. They don't live in isolated communities. They are able to participate on equal footing with other people in Canadian society. That is not what is happening in these remote communities where people are trapped and they have no skills to be able to survive in Canadian society, and they cannot leave those terrible isolated places. And that is the big problem, is what's being argued for by Negon Sinclair and Cadmus Delorme is terribly destructive for the Aboriginal population. Aboriginal people need the same things that all other human beings do, which is high quality healthcare, high quality education, a scientific education, not a bunch of fairy tales and spiritual mythology. And they need to have expert educational assistance, which is not being provided in the substandard conditions that exist in those remote communities.
And also, if I may add a point regarding the person's request about, how this was affecting policy. After the Kamloops band made their claim in May, by September, they issued a full-page ad in the Globe and Mail, which Nina found, and in it, they claimed that because of this genocide that had happened, they were due reparations and they wanted the right to collect taxes on all their land. And they had many sweeping demands. And subsequently to that, they also made some kind of a covenant with the Roman Catholic Church, which has implications for all of Canada and all Christian and Catholic dioceses. And again, they're trying to squeeze reparations and various kinds of perks out of them based on this alleged genocide. Now, I've had one or two encounters with Canadian clerics, Catholics, and they know very little about Canadian history. And so that's one reason. If you wonder, well, why don't the Catholics speak up? Why don't the Catholic Church speak up? I think a lot of Catholics in general are ignorant of Canadian history, and particularly at the bishop level, which is unusual, but they didn't go through the Oblate diaries or the Grey Nuns diaries, and they should. Or maybe they should just go to the Dorchester Review or the Indian Residential School Research Group websites and read some of the shorter works there, particularly by Professor Jacques Rouillard. So they're trying to squeeze these reparations out of the broader society. And there was no genocide, so there's no place for these kinds of claims. As long as citizens don't know their own history, they're not going to be able to stand up against this kind of extraction and shakedown.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, is the last comment I make, because I have to leave now for another commitment, and that's the thesis of British historian Nigel Biggers, that perpetuating these myths about residential schools is that people don't know history. people don't read history. People don't care about history. And I think it's incumbent on all of us listening today to spread the word that there is a very different and a much more accurate account of the past, not just with the residential schools, but with all of Canada. We're very lucky to be in this country, and we owe much to our ancestors. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for stopping by, Jim. We appreciate it. We'll probably wrap it up here soon. I had a couple questions that I wanted to ask you guys. Actually, sorry, before we move on, I think the person, Josh's question was, do we know where this money is coming from to pay these people to tour around and kind of propagate the sort of half-truths of Kamloops? Did we kind of answer that part?
Well, I think it's, for example, various institutions like Sean Carlton, who is probably the most well-known academic talking on this subject, who wants to school denialism and spreads all sorts of misinformation and is, changes his tactics all the time to avoid the false information that he's provided in the past. He's given, like, someone will invite him to come and speak and pay him, his expenses definitely to come and speak. So, like, all sorts of universities, various nonprofit organizations that want him to come. For example, in Powell River, Vancouver Island University, the Powell River campus paid Sean Carlton to come and give a talk there. So, but Carlton claims that he doesn't take any honorarium for himself, that he gives it to various Indigenous organizations, and that could be the same for other people. So it's not known how much they're making personally, but I think it's more the kind of message. Like, do you have an academic arguing in favor of criminalizing speech is quite amazing to me, that you would see that happening, because the academics should be the people in favor of open inquiry and critical thinking. And if they're going to criminalize speech, that means that people are going to be afraid to state what they think is true. And we should be encouraging people to state what they think is true. We should also be encouraging people to argue with them and to expose how what they're saying is flawed, so that we can all reach a better understanding of the nature of reality. But that's not what's happening with the universities or the media or the school system, which is where we rely upon to develop our understanding of the world.
Very well said. Very well said. And it's really basic. It's, free speech, being able to debate this stuff, being able to disagree with one another. I think a lot of us can agree, especially if you're in this space or watching this, that Canada has really lost its way in terms of being an actual, like, free and democratic society. There may not be official too many laws that prevent you from speaking freely, but there already is this horrible social code that so many Canadians fall into, where they do not speak freely and they don't want to ruffle any feathers, and they're afraid to actually use their free speech. And, this residential school denialism, they've just created another label like racist. You want to be a racist. You don't want to be a residential school denialist. They can't keep on inventing these words to shame and maim people for speaking out. And you're right. It's very, we need to be fighting for that fundamentally. Thank you for SaveFreeSpeech.ca for hosting this space. I wanted to ask, in the spirit of trying to push for the truth, push this conversation into the mainstream. Obviously, we're doing this fundraiser for the documentary Grave Error. You can check out the link there, the fundraiser at GoFundMe. You guys are doing well. What do we got here already? Over $1,000 we just cracked. Oh my God, amazing. We're well on our way. We're getting there. Got to start somewhere. But I wanted to ask Jody Wilson-Raybould. Okay, she's a sort of outstanding former Liberal MP. She was famously stood up to Trudeau during the SNC-Lavalin scandal. She's part Indigenous. I believe she's also in BC, British Columbia. Has she said anything about this issue? Does she kind of fall in line with kind of the official narrative? Does she look like she has any potential in terms of trying to get down to the truth of the matter, or is she kind of happy to just kind of shill the same sort of narrative that, Canadians are inherently genocidal maniacs?
Well, she's one of the people who, when she left office, she left what's called a practice directive to the government lawyers that rather than trying to litigate any further claims against the government, they should just settle. And Dr. Tom Flanagan has written about this in a report for the Fraser Institute called, I think it's called A Noble Idea from Reconciliation to Reparations, something like that. But this means that without parliamentary oversight, hundreds of billions of dollars are being handed out, or tens of billions of dollars are being handed out for all kinds of causes. People are saying, look, we gotta go do ceremony across Canada. I mean, I guess Tanya Talaga was talking in a CBC interview once about how one Indigenous group brought a canoe to Kamloops and they filled it up with the spirits of the 215 and took them home, and how touching it was. So people are getting lots of money. You can go online to Canada Grants and look up different groups. And actually, I've posted on X here, I've posted an article called Peanuts and Elephants that outlines some of the fortune of money that's pouring from taxpayers' pockets to God knows what kind of causes, most of them related to this kind of issue. In fact, a while ago, I was talking with someone who told me that the cows and plows payments are coming through, meaning that somehow the effort to teach agriculture to Indian residential school students in the past and treaty people in the past failed, therefore they're entitled to payments today. And the person said, it's not going to be much. It's going to be, I don't know, maybe $20,000 or $40,000 each. And I'm like, for most people, $20,000 or $40,000 is a lot of money. But they didn't think so. They thought it was nothing. And this is a potential recipient of this money. So, this is a situation that Jody Wilson-Raybould set up with this practice directive, and Parliament has no oversight. So it's basically like there are two parallel tracks in Canadian society now. Does not know what the other is doing. And I would say that people like myself and Francis and Jim and the others who are trying to expose this, we are a thin bridge between the Aboriginal industry, if you like, and the mainstream society. And Parliament is completely disconnected from it, as far as I'm concerned, other than, Crown and Indigenous Affairs, where, like, for instance, Gary Anandasangari, as former minister in Crown and Indigenous, he actually rewrote Canadian history, and he made the Lakota Sioux people who came to Canada as refugees, and it's written all over their documents that that's what they were. He said, "We're sorry we ever called you refugees. We're sorry that we saved you from the cavalry who were coming to get you after Custer and his men were massacred." And so now they turned around, and about a couple of weeks later, after he gave this apology, they said, "Well, actually, downtown Winnipeg belongs to us. That was our traditional land." And they also said, "We want reparations for you guys having called us refugees 100 years when we were refugees. We want not only reparations, but we also want the lost economic opportunity fulfilled." So, people in the mainstream, I really think, have no idea that this is going on. And of course, the mainstream media is not covering it in any detail, or they're covering it in a sycophantic way. Sorry that I went on and on, but there you go.
No, it's okay.
If I could just say a few things as well.
Sure.
I think we are seriously untethered from reality in terms of Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal relations, and it's been happening for a number of decades, but it's only starting to be recognized today, which is that people are claiming, and this is the Aboriginal industry and the activists, that Aboriginal groups are nations, just like Germany or France. And I've heard people say things like this. Aboriginal groups are dependent enclaves of, often with 1,000 people, with no economic base and no capacity to be a nation state like anything, like even like, and it's often compared to Quebec, but Quebec has millions of people and has an economy and institutions. So this is kind of the expectation that's been built up. Instead of saying Indigenous people have cultural features which they find are very meaningful to them and they want to maintain those, but in terms of surviving, they're going to have to integrate into Canadian society just like everyone else is integrating, to be able to be productive members, to have jobs, to raise families, and so on. But about decades ago, this started to these kinds of falsehoods started to be perpetuated, and now it's even worse because you have politicians that are entering into the political system not as candidates who are representing an entire geographical area, but as activists who are representing a particular ethnicity. And that's going to have serious consequences for the ability of Canada to function. And you're seeing this in a number of different contexts. And with the Aboriginal activists, this is especially strong because there's the idea that Aboriginal people are nations that have their own sovereignty and so on. And this is just nonsensical talk that the reality has to be faced up to. And if an Indigenous person wants to go into politics and be an MP or an MLA, they are representing a geographical constituency which has all sorts of ethnicities. They are not an Aboriginal representative of their tribal grouping, whatever that happens to be. And this role is often seriously confused. And I believe with Wilson Raybould, there was a bit of this confusion in terms of how she saw her role as Attorney General when she was in federal politics.
I was just going to say, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Cocked again.
Yeah. People don't realize that there are also very big commercial and corporate interests behind this. For instance, you keep hearing that there's going to be an Indigenous-led project or an Indigenous-led wind farm. As Francis said, most bands, most of the 630-odd bands in Canada are 500 people or less. There's only one or two, or perhaps 20,000. Most of them are 500 or less. So, within a small community like that, you don't have enough expert people to run a factory or anything like that. But you might have one person, perhaps has a degree or has a particular interest, and they would be your Indigenous lead on the project. Just to give you an idea, Canada has 1.8 million Indigenous people, and Deloitte, which is planning to do a whole bunch of Indigenous-led projects, has globally 450,000 people. So, all these big accounting firms, all these big management firms see this as a huge opportunity to cash in. And when you see this is an Indigenous-led pipeline, well, they're just tapping into Indigenous funding from the federal government, right? Or you look at Williams Lake, for instance, after they made Sugarcane the movie, or as they were making it, as they made their claims about unmarked graves at St. Joseph's, they said that, Williams Lake bought the former St. Joseph Mission. Well, they bought it with $800,000 of taxpayers' money from BC residents. So they didn't buy it. BC taxpayers paid for it and gave it to them, right? So, this is the problem, is that it sounds as if an Indigenous-led project will uplift the entire community, when in fact it's usually the Aboriginal industry consultants and lawyers and one or two people on the reserve who are pocketing enormous sums of money. Hello? It's usually the Aboriginal industry consultants and lawyers and one or two people on the reserve who are pocketing enormous sums of money.
I don't know. Well, some of us are still here.
1 second, 1 second.
Anyway, I don't know what's happened.
Hello.
Still there?
Maybe it's the end.
Too much?
Shoot.
I don't know.
So we should probably end it here.
Well, some of us.
No, sorry. I'm here, guys. I got disconnected on my main account. So what we're gonna do is just to round it out. Let's just ask.
No, sorry. I'm here, guys.
Oh no,
I got disconnected on my main account.
Let's just ask for you guys.
So what we're gonna do is.
Why do you think there is such a strong, push to hide or to kind of change history and to push this narrative? We kind of been talking about it all night, but like in your kind of closing comments, Francis and Michelle, as we round this out, like why do you think there's such a concerted effort to push this false narrative?
Francis, do you want to go ahead?
Okay. Well, this is a very.
Why do you think there's such a concerted effort to push this false narrative?
Francis, do you want to go ahead?
Okay. Well, this is a very, as you can imagine, a very complicated question, but certainly the Indigenous types of fabrications that are going on, fabrications about Aboriginal policy, there's many other issues that are like this as well. So we are entering into a phase of the current economic and political system, which is beginning to collapse. I think that's my own reading of it. And because of the attempts to justify the inability of us to be able to come together and progress, so we're starting to enter into a decline. And because of that, the fabrications and the falsehoods, and this is something that George Orwell was very, very cognizant of, 70 years ago or so, or longer than that. So it's not as if this is anything new, but when you start to enter into an authoritarian period of human history, then you have all sorts of deception that's beginning to take place. And this doesn't really have anything to do with the ordinary Indigenous people. It's Aboriginal organizations being used as a tool by a constellation of political and economic forces, which seem to be tied to international capitalism and the breaking down of sovereignty to destroy democracy, to destroy democratic processes, and the gains that have been made by working class people over the last 80 years in the post-war period. The tremendous gains that were made by working class people are now under serious threat. And I really fear for the future, because unless we can recapture our ability to try to understand reality, to develop a common understanding, and to fight for a future that is going to benefit all people, we are going to be heading down a very treacherous path.
And my perspective is that I tie this in my climate Indigenous conspiracy theory. I believe it's related to the federal government's plan to have nature-based climate solutions, where they want to do carbon trading on nature. And so the local band will be like the Indigenous-led project, and people will be employed on the reserve to be water keepers, fire keepers, air guardians, and such like, land guardians, which are sort of names applied to people who, keep the land pristine and do nothing with it. And then around the world, people will use Article 6, which is part of the Paris Agreement. It was something that was finally, the rules were set last fall at COP29, just days after President Trump was elected. And you can see nature-based climate solutions on the government website. It's been there for a while. And so it's all about carbon trading between nations. And Canada, I think the government thinks it's going to cash in real big on this. To reach net zero. So I'm just going to post that to your Twitter feed here, and people can see whether or not my tinfoil hat is too tight or not.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on, Michelle, Francis Widdowson. Sorry we didn't get to hear from Simon, but once again, guys, to correct the record, documentaries are powerful. Think of your past, think from history, think from your own experiences. You saw that documentary and that changed your perspective on something. This is really what it's going to take to turn the tides. You know, it's not just going to take a tweet or a Twitter thread. It's going to take a lot more than that. And quality storytelling costs money. And if you're passionate about this issue, if you want to help correct the record with Francis Widdowson and these people trying to rectify Canadian history, then please go to their GoFundMe, which is In the Nest. And of course, also follow Francis Widdowson and follow Michelle on Twitter. Let's pump up their followers as well. That's all I can really think of for me. But is there anything else you wanted to add before we go, Francis or Michelle?
Fight now and fight hard before it's all gone.
That's right. Yeah. Without free speech, it's the cornerstone of everything else. Without free speech, you can't argue for any aspect of your case on anything that you want. So thank you so much, Greg, for hosting us. And thank you for everyone who listened.
Yes, thanks everyone for coming. That was very, very good.
Absolutely. And thanks for all this valuable information. And I'm sure we'll talk again soon, and we will, the fight continues. Thanks, guys. And yeah, this Twitter space is recorded if you guys want to listen to it back. Thanks for coming. Bye for now.
Very much.
Great. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye. Oh my gosh. I'm sorry, guys. We had some technical difficulties at the end there. Yeah, that was good though. Good space. Love Francis Widdowson. Love Jim McMurtry. Too bad we didn't get to speak to the filmmaker, but that was a lot of fun. Glad we got to do that. And yeah, someone asked in chat, hey, Greg, when is your doc coming out? It says Liquid Gal. Soon. Not soon, but a big update is coming soon where we're going to have a trailer. We're going to show some of the people that we've already interviewed. Working with the professional filmmaker. He is starting the editing. That's starting to come together. And there's still a handful of interviews I need to get done. But obviously I didn't finish it as quickly as I wanted to. This is my first documentary. So, I hope you guys can give me some sort of slack here. Because it is a much bigger project than just a tweet or just a YouTube video. And it really is going to be reaching out of our echo chamber. This is going to be a film with an E on the end that gets submitted to film festivals. It's going to be on streaming services, and it's going to be broadcast ready, which means it can be picked up by, different TV stations or kind of distribution channels and really go far. It's going to be something that essentially sends the message of like, hey, Canada is not as free as you thought it was. And here are a bunch of examples why. So it's good. It's taken more time than I wanted, but it's good. It's on the way, and there should be a really spicy, exciting trailer for you guys to see, and hopefully that'll start. You'll see me back here fundraising and streaming a lot more and talking about a lot more stuff. It's been a lot of stuff I haven't done before, of like compiling footage, putting it on hard drives, making sure it's a high quality, and all this. Like this isn't, like I said, this isn't just like your everyday YouTube video. It's a broadcast ready film. Yeah, it's good. I'm learning a lot and that sort of thing. But yeah, there will be new updates soon coming down the pipe. Thanks again for watching. Love you guys. Is there anything else I wanted to say Thank you for moderating, Trent, in the chat. I appreciate it. Ragin, thanks for coming out. Jen Saul, Liquid Gal, Odious Patton, Scott Free Freedom, Jen Saul, Anderson Paladin, Ruby Shadow, thank you for hanging out. Yeah, there's going to be big stuff on the way. I know I've been pretty silent the past little bit. But I've been working, you know. We will talk to you soon. Thanks again for tuning in. And yeah, until next time. Do 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 do